For our second lecture for this week, we're going to be talking about Baptist beginnings in America. When we think about the Baptist beginning in America, we tend to think about our 4th and 5th grade elementary school classes and the Pilgrims, and rightly so. The Puritans coming to America did a great work in the United States, but really that doesn't give us a very good picture of what the religious climate was in the United States. Certainly New England was settled by Puritans. But the southern colonies were different, and the middle colonies were different, in that the middle colonies did not have an Anglican church. And of course, while the New England Puritans were separatists, the southern colonies were Anglican. And particularly South Carolina and Virginia had the established Anglican church, whereas New England would be separatist and Puritan, and the middle colonies they had no established church, more or less Pennsylvania, the Quakers, and religious liberty. So you basically had three sections in America when Baptists came to America, and when religion came to America there, as far as the Protestant religion goes. Now, Catholic were part of Maryland, and then New York were representing Catholic there as America was settled. But by and large, it was the largest percentage was Protestant, and it was broken down into separatist New England Puritans, Southern Colony Anglican Established Church, Virginia, South Carolina, and the middle colonies would be Quakers, Baptist, and no established church. So when you look at the beginnings of Baptist in America, you have to look at those three sections. You have to look at New England, then you have to look at the southern colonies and the middle colonies. So as we go through this lecture for this class period, we will be examining those areas, and we'll begin where Baptists began, and that was in New England. And of course, the first personality in New England that we need to look at when the Baptist begins is Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams was a Puritan. He was a separatist when he began, and he was a particular Baptist. He was influenced and was mentored by Edward Coke, one of the greatest judges and jurists of the 17th century, in the time of John Locke, John Owen, Edward Coke. Very important time in jurisprudence. And Roger Williams was an apprentice or a mentor under Edward Coke. Williams began to become a Puritan and accepted Puritanism and separatism, and he believed that that the individual should have a right to interpret the Bible for themselves. He believed that the state church didn't have a right to interpret the Bible for you. He believed in religious liberty, and so in that context, he began to get persecuted in England for his beliefs, which made him come to America. So when he comes to America, he lands in Boston, and he meets the Puritan separatists. And he begins to teach there in the church in Boston with the Pilgrims, and John Cotton, and Winthrop, and those Puritan divines there. And he begins to teach, but he begins to teach independent ideas. In other words, the Puritans of the separatists in New England, the Pilgrims, they believed that the state should enforce religion. So they were setting up a city on the hill, and they would be a lot like the new millennial. They were setting up the kingdom of God, that city on a hill. Roger Williams objected to that. Roger Williams believed that while the state had the right to enforce the civil law, as we spoke in last lecture, that laws against murder, stealing, perjury, those areas, marriage, adultery. He believed the state should have a right to govern those areas. Williams did not believe the state had the right to dictate how you worshiped or even who you worshiped. Roger Williams believed that we should buy the Indians' land. He believed that the Puritans were treating the Indians wrong, and that they were annexing their land and giving them nothing for it, basically beads and things. And Williams objected to those things along the lines of religious liberty. So, needless to say, Roger Williams got in trouble with the Puritans in Boston and the Pilgrims, and they basically ran him out of town, and he went to Providence, Rhode Island. And there he set up a believer's baptism, biblical authority, religious liberty, and again he believed that the magistrate could only enforce the civil laws. Williams became a Baptist for about a few months and accepted believer's baptism, and then Williams went on further than that and became what we call a seeker, somewhat like the Quakers. In that the difference between the Baptist and the Quakers would be the Baptist believed in biblical authority, the Quakers would believe in inner light, intuition. So they would not be with biblical authority. They believed that revelation came right to them. So they didn't revere the Bible as the Baptists did. So that would be one of the central views of Quakerism. And really, if you do much of a study of Quakerism and the Enlightenment, you'll see that kind of intuitional epistemology and that kind of belief system sort of runs together with Enlightenment, where you would actually reject special revelation and believe in individual revelation directly to you through the intuition. But Williams went on further past, but while he was a Baptist there, he did set up the first Baptist church there in Providence, Rhode Island. Some of the contributions of Roger Williams was missionary to the Indians, religious liberty for all, including heretics, separation of church from the state. Now, again, Williams did not believe that that meant that we should have a secular state or anything like that. He believed that the Christians should be able to participate with the state. He just believed that you should be able to worship and believe whichever way you want to in the state. He was a promoter of democracy, and he founded the First Baptist Church in America there in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, that church continued on as a particular Baptist church under Morgan Edwards and James Manning, and they began as particular Baptist in Providence, Rhode Island. They went away from that and became fairly liberal there for about 60 years with some Unitarian tendencies. But then in the 18th century, they come back toward the particular Baptist belief system in the Providence, Rhode Island Baptist Church there. Of course, John Clark is another Baptist in Newport, Rhode Island, who started the Second Baptist Church in America. And in that church, there were two factions there in Portsmouth Church in Newport, Rhode Island. The two factions were the Hutchinson faction and the Clark faction. And the Hutchinson faction believed in the authority of the inner light. And so, again, they would believe in tongue speaking. They would be quite Arminian. They would believe that God came to them and in dreams and visions, and they did not revere the Scripture's authority. On the other hand, in the Newport, Rhode Island church there, Clark would, that part of the church, or faction of the church, revered and stood on the authority of Scripture. The First Baptist Church in the Massachusetts area was the Swansea Baptist Church. Of course, you have Baptist churches beginning in Boston, and they were particular. And in Kittery, Maine, in New England, you had Baptist churches started by William Screven. Screven is important because he moved from Maine and goes to Charleston, South Carolina later on, and we'll mention him a little later. So that's somewhat of a summary of the Baptist in New England. Let's move now and talk about the Baptist in the Middle Colonies. Unlike the New England Baptists, who were separatist, and the Southern colonies were Anglican. So they had the state religion. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Unlike the New England and Southern colonies, the Middle colonies never set up a state religion. In other words, in the Middle colonies, there was no state religion. In New England, you had the separatists who were setting up a state religion, which Roger Williams objected to. In the Southern colonies, we'll talk about this a little later, you had the Anglican Church authority there and the state authority. But in the Middle colonies, the Middle colonies did not have a state religion. There are several reasons why that is. Number one is the Quaker influence in Pennsylvania. The Quakers, like the Baptists, did not believe that the state should dictate the conscience concerning religion. So the Quakers believed you should be free to worship any way you wanted to, any God you wanted to, or be an atheist, or Catholic, or Protestant, or whatever. They believed that. So the Middle College was religiously pluralistic, in that they believed that you could have any religion you wanted there. Another reason why there was no state religion in the Southern Colonies is because of the commercial enterprise, which means that they were setting up free enterprise and commercial and different companies and land companies were coming in and were being driven more pragmatically. So they didn't establish religion there, because most of what was coming in there a lot of times was people who were buying and selling and investment companies. So it was more centered around commerce. One of the first Baptist churches in the Middle Colony was Thomas Duncan, who was the first Baptist preacher of the Middle Colonies. The first Baptist church in the Middle Colonies was started by Elias Keach, and later on his son Benjamin Keach, who's famous for bringing singing, which was a real controversy in the Baptist church at the time. Some churches didn't believe we shouldn't sing in churches. Keach brought hymn singing to churches. His son there. Interesting side note on Benjamin Keach is Benjamin Keach started preaching before he was saved, and actually Benjamin Keach was saved by his own preaching. He preached the gospel, realized he was lost, and became a Christian. Sometimes I'm convinced that getting saved might enhance a lot of Baptist preachers' ministries there. Just being facetious in a joke there, but it would go a long way. Being saved would go a long way in preaching the power of the gospel. We need to be born again, don't we? Amen. So Elias Keach and Benjamin Keach started the first Baptist church in the Middle Colonies. Thomas Killingsworth and Obadiah Holmes were two other personalities who began Baptist churches in the Middle Colonies. Now, some of the contributions of the Baptists in the Middle Colonies, they formed the First Baptist Association. The Philadelphia Baptist Association in 1707 started there. So ideas of Baptist associations and conventions really come out of the Middle Colonies in 1707. They also adopted a confession of faith for their association. They also established the First Baptist College in 1764. And the Middle Colonies, and the Baptists in the Middle Colonies launched the first home mission work in the Baptist in America. So this brings us to the third group there, the Baptists in the Southern Colonies. Again, the Southern Colonies had a state religion. They had established the Anglican Church, like in England. The Church of England was a state church in Virginia and South Carolina. Now again, the New England colonies, that was Puritan separatist. They were not Anglican or Church of England. They were setting up the state church, separatist church of their own, but they believed that the state should enforce religion. The Southern colonies was the Church of England, Virginia and South Carolina. So they persecuted Baptists. And if you're ever traveling in the Virginia-North Carolina line there, and you're in the area of Virginia Beach and the bay there, and you cross the large bridge going across the bay there, you'll see a lot of historical markers where Baptists were actually beaten and hung. Because really, to come out of North Carolina and preach as a Baptist in Virginia was illegal, because Virginia was Church of England, and they'd beat you if you was a Baptist. And they even hung several, just for being a Baptist, not for being an atheist, for being a Baptist. Again, this is important for us to realize as Baptists the important role we played in American history. So the Southern colonies were the Church of England. Now that began to change during the Enlightenment when the third Bishop of Earl of Shaftesbury, Ashley Cooper, got a land grant in South Carolina, and him and John Locke together came to America. And John Locke came to Charleston for some time. And John Locke, while he advocated religious freedom, I mentioned this in the last lecture, John Locke did advocate religious freedom, and he did talk about toleration and wrote a wonderful book on toleration, but John Locke still believed in a state church. Whereas Baptists believed in religious freedom. So again, the Enlightenment only went so far. Baptists believed in freedom of conscience. Now, during this same time, when Ashley Cooper in Charleston was establishing religious liberty there, William Screven moved from Maine to Charleston. And this is when the Baptists started in the Southern colonies. And they were persecuted a little bit too because, again, Southern colonies, they were beginning to grant under the Earl of Shaftesbury and John Locke beginning religious freedom, but they still were holding the brakes on Baptists and the freedom they hold. But William Screven moves to Maine basically because William Screven was escaping the Indian raids going on in Maine, and he also his business was cutting timber for topmast, and they were running out of timber in Maine, and the new colonies in South Carolina were beginning up, so he moved to South Carolina to continue his business of cutting timber for topmast for ships. So that brought William Screven to South Carolina and the Southern colonies and established Baptists in the Southern colonies. And again, they were persecuted there too, but had more freedom than they had in New England. Now, as we close this lecture, let's just profile the Baptists just a little bit. The Baptists were independent. While England was separatist, they still believed in a state church, but the Baptists were independent. And that means that each church was independent of the state, congregational, and could select their own pastors without the state selecting pastors for them or governing them. So the Baptist profile was independent. They were diverse. Part of the diversity, as we've already discussed, and we'll discuss in the further lectures, was the particular Baptist and the General Baptist. Again, General Baptists were more Arminian, and they believed you could fall from grace. Again, they would believe in tongue speaking and more toward a Quaker area idea sometimes. A lot of times the General Baptists would fall into Unitarian and anti-Trinitarian belief systems. But we'll see in next week, we'll see how the General Baptists corrected that. But you had General Baptists, and you also, in the Baptist profile in America, you had particular Baptists who were Calvinistic. Now, they went too far many times in hyper-Calvinism, but we'll see in the next lecture next week how they begin to, particular General Baptists, tolerate each other, and even to this day continues on. While you did have, because of the Enlightenment, particular Baptists went way too far in the philosophy of determinism and free will, and General Baptists did the same thing and created their own problems that we'll talk about next lecture, but those were some problems there. But there was a diversity. Particular and General Baptists were together and really were unified in a lot of areas, especially in religious liberty. So there were some persistent problems. Again, they argued over predestination. The Baptists at the time argued over the laying on of the hands. Some Baptists believed that when a new convert came in, you baptized him, but then you laid on everybody laid hands on them, and they argued about that. I mentioned a moment ago singing during worship. Some churches were against that. Some churches were for it. Some things never change. We still have the worship wars now. Some Baptists argued over Sabbatarianism. There were some Baptists who were Sabbatarian Baptists, which meant that they went to church on Saturdays. Others rejected that. Some of the Baptists were radical millennialists. Like the Fifth Monarchy movement there with Oliver Cromwell, some believed that the millennium was being set up now and the church was reigning and going to reign for Christ in the millennium. And so you had some in New England and the separatists there who believed that, and they were trying to set up a state church, and they believed the reign of Christ was reigning then. And you had that argument among Baptists. So really, if you want to profile the internal life of Baptists during this period, Baptist worship was quite informal, and they emphasized the Bible. They emphasized religious liberty, and they emphasized believers' baptism.